back to Secret Weapons, and today we are taking a look at the Space Force by Alexander Pedals. Let's get the most obvious thing out of the way here, which is I love how much more compact and convenient traditionally big box reverbs have gotten, and this is the kind of culmination of that, in my opinion. The Space Force is a MIDI-capable stereo 8-mode reverb with a wealth of features, a very small screen, and a ton of control in a very standard, usable, easy box, which is so nice. The Space Force is building on a lot of what Alexander has been doing in the last couple of years, very envelope-pushing digital effect design stuff. Smaller enclosures, way more information packed into small spaces like this screen, and real envelope pushing creativity. Like I said, there are 8 modes in this thing, and you have your basics. You've got your spring, your plate, your hall, that kind of thing. You also have self-contained exploratory and experimental reverbs in this thing. You have a lo-fi reverb that is essentially 90s shoegaze tones in a box. You have a mode in here that is a delay and a reverb in parallel with one another with separate controls for both. And you have like an analog reverb in this thing, which is basically like a 90s style multi-tap delay that kind of smears into a reverb. It's very lo-fi and vibey and cool. There's a lot in this thing. And from mode to mode, you have a ton of variance. You've got multiple waveforms for your modulation that can be applied to almost all of these engines, but each engine handles that rate, depth, and waveform differently. The plate, for example, has a tape flange modulation to it, whereas like the hall is more of a chorus, and the spring is a tremolo. And by the way, the spring is a really good tremolo in it. You heard it on the intro, and you'll hear it later when we dive in. You have tap tempo control over your modulation rate, and you can choose the subdivisions that you want. There's a lot in this thing. This screen gives you a ton of information, which is really useful, including like the name of your preset and the mode you're on, and then all of your like engine specific control stuff. And really quick, a word to the wise here. By default, all of the Alexander stuff I've ever played, the fever pitch, when you scroll through those different pages of parameters to make adjustments, to me, it snaps back to page 1 too quickly. You scroll over to page 2 or 3, you make your changes, you test your changes, and sometimes by the time you're done testing them, especially with like long reverb trails, it's already jumped back to page 1 and you have to scroll through again. So global configuration in this thing, you can change that. You can actually set this thing to stay on the page you're on for much longer. I believe it's half a second, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, or it just stays forever. I set it to stay forever immediately because that's how I like to use this kind of thing. So there's your pro tip. You'll save yourself a lot of time in the editing process if you change that parameter to your taste very quickly. So you're welcome. But that also speaks to something that I think is very, very compelling about what Alexander is doing, and the Space Force in particular, which is the level of granular control. Like I said, you have I think 4 waveforms. You have a saw, a sine, a square, and a triangle that can be applied to any modulation, which means that spring reverb's tremolo that we talked about, that can be a square wave or like a pulsating sawtooth, like very like sidechainy sounding, or a traditional sine wave style tremolo circuit. You've got all of those options available to you. You have a distortion on one of the modes for shoegaze tones. You have a ton of traditional and exploratory sounds in this thing. There's a lot to unpack in this thing, to the point where I feel like there's no point in me talking anymore. We just need to go to those pedal board samples. Like I said, this thing has stereo in, stereo out, there's MIDI control, there is ramping, there is a ton of stuff you can do with this. We're not going to dive into all of the configurable sides of this thing because this video is going to be long enough just covering sound samples. So the manual is incredibly useful. If you pick one of these up, I highly recommend you dig into that manual and kind of learn how to get the most out of all of the kind of control features available in this thing. But for now, let's just dive straight into those sound samples and really kind of explore what's available on each of the reverb algorithms in the Space Force. Before we get into our sound samples, let's go ahead and talk through our signal chain and our context. I am playing my Jennings Voyager into the Origin Effects Cali 76 compressor, the Milkman Poptop boost, and the Browne Amplification Carbon overdrive. From there we go to the Meris Enzo, and then in stereo to the Strymon Volante, the Space Force, and our DAW, where we're using the Benson Chimera plugin for amplifiers. This is what that sounds like with just the compressor, the boost, and the amp. So let's go ahead and bring in the Space Force. We're going to start things off with the plate algorithm, and as we kind of roll through, we'll jump between all of the different algorithms, just kind of in the current preset that we're in right now, as opposed to building presets for each and every one of them. So let's start things off with the plate, with everything at noon, and we'll run through the different sound samples and the different feature sets that each individual algorithm has that makes it so unique beyond just the base level. So we'll dig into some extra settings like the mix control on this first one here with the plate. I really like how solid this plate feels right off the bat. It's got a great splash to it. It's got a great diffusion amount in that plate reverb. It can get nice and kind of small and tight. Or like otherworldly large. Oh, whoops. Yeah, if you hit maximum there, you'll just go to hold, which is pretty useful if you want to do kind of that bed to play over kind of thing. So massive plate right there. And then up here you have your damp, which is basically your high EQ. So full bright. But maybe you want something a little bit more subtle. You can dial back that damp. Super bright. Super dark. And that damp will actually shorten your overall potential reverb length, because as you're kind of high passing your decay, you're losing more of it faster. Which is a really useful interplay to have, especially if you like, you know, sometimes you want that big ambient washy thing where you have a lot of very present reverb for kind of middle position clean tone. But you kind of switch over to like a nice like rhythm guitar tone. And that's way too much reverb for that. So dial that damp way back, and even without changing your mix or your size, just dialing back that high frequency. Really useful, really helpful for dialing that in. And like I said earlier in the video, one of the things that I really like about the Space Force is that each mode has its own kind of approach to all the parameters. You're not getting the same modulation on every single algorithm. For example, the plate that we're on right now, you have a pre-delay in the form of kind of like a tape pre-delay. But it's super subtle, which I like. I like having a subtle pre-delay. And your modulation engine on this plate is like a tape flange. Which takes us so far past what you expect out of a plate reverb, if we're being honest. Here, let's go ahead and go full wet on this one. Just so you can kind of hear. We got the sine wave. Triangle. Your square. Your sawtooth. Yeah. And of course, you can have this tap control on this left side set your modulation rate. And you can use this control up here to set your subdivision, which is incredibly useful. Including bypassing it completely if that's what you want. So let's jump over to this modulated hall reverb. Our parameters have changed up because we've changed algorithms. We still have kind of like decay and mix. The mix is always going to stay the same. Size is essentially the same thing here, but obviously applied to a hall reverb. This is kind of like an 80s digital hall reverb kind of thing. And you're going to have a tone control, which is basically your high pass filter, similar to the damp, but it'll kind of interact a little bit differently. But on page 2, you'll have a low control instead of the tape pre-delay like you did on the last one. So we can dial in our high control right there. And then on page 2, you have a low control. Or you can cut all that low end out. Let's bring it back in because I like a nice lush low end hall reverb typically. Let's take it nice and low. So again, you can kind of dial something in nice and subtle if you want. Or really drift off into space. And let's add a little bit of movement to that. So let's jump over to the pitch reverb, which is essentially going to replace your modulation section with 2 selectable pitch shifters for the reverb trails. It can be anywhere from detuned to quantized pitch shifting. Again, we have our size, we have our tone control, we have a mix, and then as you jump over, you've got the amount of up, the amount of down, and the interval that you want for each of them. So let's bring in like no second one and only the first one, and you can either have it be like a detuned reverb. And then let's bring in that second one for something a little bit cool. Let's actually reverse those. Let's take octave down on the second one, nice and subtle, and then or nice and strong actually, and let's bring in a 5th up, but like softer in the mix. Okay, now we're jumping over to the spring, which I actually really, really like. Let's go ahead and take our rate and our depth out really quick, because the modulation engine in the spring reverb is a tremolo, which is awesome because that's what you want out of a spring reverb. So let's dial in. You have your tone control. You've got your ping, which is essentially the amount of splash. So all the way down. Or way up. Let's darken that up a little bit. And now let's jump over here. You've got your tank size. Which isn't going to get massive. This isn't one of those like other springs that I've really loved that basically just turn into hall reverbs when you crank it. This remains a spring. It just gets to be a very big spring. But then you get to bring in and let's bring in the Strymon Volante delay in front of it so that we get a little bit more decay out of that. And the tremolo comes after the reverb, which is great because it really bolsters that tremolo. And it's worth noting that these waveforms still apply. So you've got your sine wave, your triangle, your square, and your saw. Which gives you like a very weird, otherworldly, impossible kind of spring reverb tremolo system. And again, it's worth remembering, you've also got that tap tempo available to you. But don't worry, it still gets subtle. So let's take a nice hard left turn here and jump over to this lo-fi algorithm. This is like a 90s style shoegaze inspired reverb. Think kind of like rack reverb from the 90s plus distortion on the trails as one of your parameters that you can control. And then you also have access to that modulation engine still. So you can kind of create those big Kevin Shields, My Bloody Valentine style pitch bends entirely within the Space Force. So I've got the distortion and all the modulation pulled out right now so we can just hear what that reverb trail sounds like. Oh, let's turn the Volante back off. It's pretty subtle on its own. But you start to bring in that dirt. Let's go full wet so you can really hear that. Jump over to that modulation engine. Let's set it to a sine so we get that pitch drop. So let's jump on over to analog reverb, which is basically a analog delay set to have kind of cascading repeats to give it the kind of illusion of reverb. You hear that? The trick with this is to kind of keep that time knob in a pretty specific place. When you have it way out, you get a very kind of delay-y sounding thing. Very, like, noticeably delay system. But you can get kind of a reverberated thing when you kind of hold out chords and stuff. And then you've got your repeats over here. But as you kind of cluster those repeats closer together, you get more of a reverberated sound. It kind of gives me the impression of kind of like a tiled room reverb. And of course, the modulation on this one is a chorusing effect. That's where we were. And lastly here, we have our echo verb, which offers an overall wet-dry mix here for a delay and a reverb in parallel. So you have your tone control and your reverb amount, and then on the next page over, you have your delay time, your repeats, your delay EQ, and your delay mix. So let's take the delay completely out. Let's get back over here, and let's dial in this room reverb really quick and get comfortable with that, and then we'll bring in the delay as well. So yeah, reverb at minimum, gets rid of it completely. Or you can go full hold reverb. Absolutely massive room reverb. jump over to page 2 and let's bring in this delay.